Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. This is exactly what is needed for us like this, where business meets innovators and entrepreneurs, meeting investors, and also meeting representatives from the public sector who makes change happen, sharing ideas, sharing experiences, and looking forward together. I will share with you two perspectives today. One has to do with the financial services sector's perspective on the transformational forces that we are facing and some of the effects and how this looks seen from an investor financial services perspective. The second thing is to share with you some of the thoughts that we have developed in the Green Competitiveness project in Norway that was set up by the government last June, and we are to deliver our report in October this year. And I will try to leave some time at the end for a couple of questions, if that is something you would like. Let me start by just drawing our attention to two transformational forces that's hitting us at the same time. One is climate change and the fundamental challenges of sustainable development. The other is digitization and the disruption of all key major existing business models. These two transformational forces have in common the fact that they bear with them both risks and opportunities. Managed in the right way, this might be drivers both of investments, of business opportunities, of profitability and return. If we stick our head in the sand and pretend it's not happening, it's probably a very, very risky strategy that could jeopardize not only the business in the short term, but the fundamentals of the business model in the long term. It's also an interesting fact that digitization might be one of the key forces that can help us accelerate the necessary change to a low carbon, low emission society. So if we are able to make these forces work together, that can be helpful in more than one way. This simple chart, this simple relationship, showing us that we are spending resources in a way which is not sustainable, given that we would like to see future generations being able to meet their needs. It tells us that we currently is on a track spending resources equal to 1.5 Earths, and by 2050 we will reach 2.3 Earths, and unfortunately we have only one. Reminding us that we are currently running the global society in a fundamentally unsustainable way. And I think that none of us would run our own businesses in this way. So business as usual is not an option. But this simple relationship has taken us from awareness, where a lot of people started to be interested in this, trying to understand what is going on, to acceptance. Accepting that this is not only an environmental concern, but a fundamental force that might have geopolitical implications with consequences for risk-return relationships, for investments, and for global trade. So it has attracted fundamental interest from the business community and from the financial services sector. So we have gone from awareness to acceptance, and we are now in the phase of action. This is a time when it's actually happening. And Mark Carney, the governor of the Central Bank of UK, held a very famous speech in Lloyd's of London this fall, calling the financial services sector to action. And his key point is that we need to take the environmental, social, and governance factors into account today. And time is of the essence, both for investors, for banks, and for the insurance industry. Having a closer look at the financial services industry, where do we face the consequences of climate change? Where do we see the relevance of the risk-return relationships that's changing? And how does this affect our business? Why are we relevant and why should we care? Well, there are three key areas. The first is that when we hear the discussions about creative destruction and Trumpeter, who are the creative destructors? Well, that's mainly the financial services sector, deciding who should get the investments and who should not, who should get funding through the banks and who should not. In that transition, the financial services sector plays a hugely important role and needs to understand in depth what is going on. Secondly, when it comes to innovation, the funding sources are found in with private investors and in the financial services sector. And the third area has to do with building resilient local communities, both when it comes to the mitigation agenda, but also when it comes to the adaptation agenda. Let's dig into this a little bit. When it comes to the transformation we are facing, it has some characteristics reminding us that this is something new. First of all, the investment requirements are significant. The new climate economy, they have estimated that by 2030, around 90,000 billion US dollars needs to be invested in new infrastructure alone. This is a growth signal into the industry of a magnitude we haven't seen in generations. So it is an investment need and an investment requirement. And when banks are doing their credit assessment, normally they look at historic cash flows, they do their normal assessments of risks and return elements in the project they are financing, in the business they are financing. What they need to do and what they are about to do is to build their expertise and competence in understanding how does the climate change affect the business model. In which way are the risks in your cash flow affected by changes in regulation, changes in the cost of capital, changes in customer behavior, changes in the fundamental drivers of the strategy for your business model. In addition, we see that, as I mentioned, the need for investments in the infrastructure. The development of green bonds is relatively recent, but has seen a very interesting growth rate. We will see more of this. We will see that green bonds will grow significantly going forward, but we will also see innovative new solutions in green financing to meet the requirements and to streamline to the projects that we are facing. And this is a source of funding that's important for people wanting things to happen, and it is a source of business for the financial services sector that will grow in importance. Last but not least, when it comes to sustainable investments, the Nordic countries, including the Baltic region, is among the leading places on this planet when it comes to responsible investing, trying to understand the risk-return relationships driven by ESG factors. In Norway, of course, everybody looks at the Norwegian Petroleum Fund developing their responsible investing strategies since 2004. But the fundamental fact is that the private investors were driving that development and have been doing so for a number of years. If you run a company and you want to attract institutional investors, you need to understand and be able to present and report on the consequences in your business of the changes that we are facing. Just to give you one example, out of our region and down to Egypt, we know that Egypt will lack around 20 billion liters of water a year from 2020. If you're in a business depending on water, it's 100% certain that that will affect the risk of your cash flow. And as a consequence, the discount factor the institutional investor will use will increase, and the value of the cash flow will be reduced. So to have a dialogue with the investor, trying to understand what is key, is probably an important thing to do going forward. The second thing is innovation. We know that most of the new jobs that will be created in the next 10 to 15 years will be created in existing companies. New business models, new products, new services, but based on existing businesses. But we also know that existing businesses cannot produce the number of jobs we need, cannot produce the value creation that we require. So we are fundamentally dependent on innovation, entrepreneurship, new businesses, and new ventures. And to make that happen, financing is key. And we need financing through the entire phase, from identifying first-class research with commercialization potential into the pilot phase and industrialization and new jobs and value creation. So we need seed capital environments. We need venture capital players, in particular around universities, around the hubs where we know that innovation happens. We need private equity players who can take small companies and prepare them either for mergers and acquisitions and with other companies, or prepare them for a listing. And we need the institutional owners that can see to that the long-term equity funding of the company is in place. So we need to develop an ecosystem with researchers, with commercial players and business people and the financial services community to work together to make this happen. Last but not least, when it comes to the perspective of the financial services sector, has to do with building resilient local communities. We know that even if we are successful in our mitigational efforts to reduce CO2 emissions, we will face rather fundamental changes in weather conditions and in the risk profile geographically. So we need to understand how can we prevent and how can we adapt. And one of the key factors is to understand the risk and set a price on risk. To understand the value of prevention, insurance companies, they have for ages worked with fire prevention. To set a value on the house that didn't burn is much more difficult than to set a value on the house that has already burnt down. But that is the task in hand when we are to invest intelligently and smartly in preventive measures in the coastline around the 30-ish countries that will be most affected by climate change. In the areas where we know that if we are unsuccessful in building resilient local communities, we will see massive migration, which we are strategically and operationally unable to deal with. So we know intuitively that the value of prevention is high. What we can contribute is to set a price on it, to enable us as private investors to do the right investments, and to enable public sector and governments to put in place the necessary measures. The second element is the value of time. You have seen some of the tsunamis, some of the large catastrophes, and people have tried to understand how much is 5 minutes worth, how much is 15 minutes worth, how much is 30 minutes worth. And the value of a half an hour is fundamental. And in a world where we are more and more interconnected and where we can use big data to process and develop scenarios and understanding of what will happen, with 3 billion people on the planet next year being connected through internet, we have better than ever opportunities to connect and to communicate. So to try to give people a warning will reduce negative effects and will have a very strong positive impact. Then we have public-private partnerships. One example. In Norway, the non-life insurance companies have worked very closely with local communities to use our loss figures together with the local communities planning information to see to that we are planning more resilient and better local communities with a lower risk of flooding and consequences of a wetter and wilder climate. The value of this is significant, both on a society level, but also on a financial level. So financial services sector tries to understand this, tries to be part of both the necessary transformation, the innovation and entrepreneurship that is going on, and to work closely with public sector in developing more resilient local communities. And this has been the backdrop when the Norwegian government last year in June appointed an expert commission. It's the smallest commission possible to appoint. It's only 2 people. It's myself and Connie Hedegaard that used to be EU's environmental commissioner. We are asked to develop a national strategy for green competitiveness in Norway. And the government has said that we would like to have your suggestions on meeting 3 objectives at the same time. Meet very ambitious targets for reduced CO2 emissions, create new jobs, new green jobs, and point number 3, see to that you support the long-term value creation in the Norwegian society. The way we have dealt with this is that we are working with universities, with businesses, with business groups, with innovators, and we have had so-called dialogue meetings all over Norway. Up until this point, we have had 44 dialogue meetings and more than 120 meetings with individuals, businesses, and people having something to contribute into the work. We have looked at this along a number of dimensions, but 3 dimensions is probably key. Also, when you're looking at this from an innovator's point of view or an entrepreneur's point of view. Perspective number 1 is to look at the sectors where we really need to reduce the carbon footprint. Point number 2 is to look at sectors where we do think that we have embryos of competitive advantage or where we have demonstrated that we have competitive advantages on a regional or an international arena. And perspective number 3 are what we call smart enablers, making change happen. What does it take? What do we need to put in place to accelerate the transition that we know needs to happen? And it's pretty clear, looking at the sectors that we need to transform fundamentally to meet the ambitious targets for CO2 emissions, it's 4 sectors. It's in the Norwegian context. Sector number 1 is the transport sector. Currently, they represent more than 16 million tons of CO2 emissions a year. It's the biggest emitter. What we need to see is a fundamentally change from hydrocarbon-driven hydrocarbons as a source of energy into the transport sector. And we need to see electricity. We need to see hydrogen. We need to see biofuel on a level we have not seen so far. And you are perhaps aware of the fact that Norway is probably the biggest live test case for electrical personal-driven cars have been a sales success. We spend between 4 and 5 billion a year on the electrical vehicle program in Norway, so it is not at all cheap. But it is a success in massively increasing the number of cars running on the roads. And what we see is that all the large car producers, they are coming to Norway to try to understand what is going on. In June, the board of Volkswagen, probably one of the most influential boards in the corporate sector globally, put their board meeting in Oslo. And they spent half the board meeting walking around the streets of Oslo, looking at how does this work in practice. The interesting thing with that is that they are doing that not necessarily because they're interested in seeing what is going on in Oslo, but because they want to understand the business implications. How can we develop strategies? How can we understand the market so that we can develop products, services, business models, and solutions that can enable us to grow and enable us to create value? And that is one of the things that we have really thought about, because the fact is that Norway spends between 4 and 5 billion a year on electrical vehicles, but it's hard to see that we have been able to create one single new job in Norway based on that strategy, and we should do that. We should think through how can we use this as a driving force for innovation, for new products and solutions in Norway that we can sell in Norway, but also on a regional and international basis. So transport sector is key. I could talk about the ferries. I could talk about heavy lorries. Let's revert to that if you have questions. But we need a fundamental transformation of the transport sector. Secondly, the petroleum sector currently one thing is the petroleum they produce is of course a key part of the problem, but also the production process is a part of the problem. So the production process emits around 14 million tons CO2 a year, and they need to fundamentally reduce that, are working on that, and they will deliver us a roadmap to our commission shortly. The third sector is manufacturing industries, 11 million tons CO2 emissions a year in Norway. And you know what, if you go to Europe, most people will say that power generation is the key source of CO2 emissions, especially coal power plants. In Norway, 98% of power production is already renewable. So what we have to attack is the production processes. And if you produce 1 ton of cement, you produce 2 tons of CO2 in doing that. And that is not a good idea. I mean, we cannot do that. So we need to find a way of capture the CO2 in the production process, to transport it somewhere and store it securely. So we need to look at the production processes. And we have been able to motivate the process industries of Norway to work together. And it's interesting because the only Norwegian-owned company is Hydro. So Elkem is owned by China. Glencore is owned from Canada. And we know that Heidelberg is owned globally, but have their strong position in Germany. We have made all of them work together, and they delivered their roadmap to a low-carbon society. And they say that we should have as an ambition to be carbon neutral in 2045. But a lot of things has to happen, and you should look into the roadmap if you're interested to be a part of the solution. The last sector is the agricultural sector. And I mean, we were warned, you shouldn't step into that because it's difficult. But of course we have to step into that because it's a part of the problem, but it's also, as a consequence, a part of the solution. 4.4 million tons CO2 emissions a year, and that is from the environmental sector alone. That is not the tractors, that is not transportation, that is not the industry processes of agricultural products. It's just proper. agriculture. So what we need to see is the use of new technologies. We need to see an increase in crop yields and a significantly reduced global footprint from that sector. And starting to work with them, it's fascinating to see the magnitude of ideas, of competence, of technologies that's ready to be implemented given the right incentives. So we have hopes. We will receive a roadmap from the agricultural sector late August, early September, and it's going to be very, very interesting to see what kind of ambition that will be presented. So that's the 4 sectors we need fundamentally to transform and reduce CO2 emissions by more than 40% by 2030, and basically 0 emissions in 2050. And to be able to do that, we need to go from a linear economic system into a circular economy, making one guy's waste, turn that into the next guy's resources and raw materials. Very quickly, on some of the areas we are looking at for possible competitive building, really competitiveness in a Norwegian context, you will not be surprised that aquaculture is a part of it. Currently, a large salmon costs more than a barrel of oil, which gives you some perspective to the importance of that sector. And when it comes to currency generation in Norway, the aquaculture sector is already very, very important, but we have only utilized a small fraction of the potential of that sector. The renewable energy sector has been developed in Norway for the last 100 years. We should take that on to a next stage. But I also think it's important to see to that within the broader space of life sciences, a lot of things will happen. People say that, you know, the law that the processing capacity in the computer industry is doubled every 18 months. They say that in biotech, the doubling time is 6 times as high. It's very, very dynamic. A lot of things are going on. And in some areas, we have competitive advantages. Quickly, on some of the smart enablers, I would like to raise 3. One I've already commented on, and that is the financial services sector. We need an active, competent, and dynamic financial services sector to make change happen. The second has to do with electrification. In continental Europe, a lot of focus is on changing power generation from CO2-based into renewables. We're already there. So what we are focusing on is to try to understand effective electrification of as many processes as possible. And that will be the focus in continental Europe the next 3, 5, 7 years. So we are a little bit ahead of the game there. And we should try to use those competences to develop systems, structures, products and services that can be of interest to other people going forward. And then last but not least, I would like to comment on public procurement. I mean, we have constructed a monster when it comes to the system around public procurement. I mean, it's a bureaucracy from here to eternity. And the effect of public procurement, the governments in Norway purchases things for around 450 billion a year. And the only effect that has currently is to reduce margins on yesterday's technologies. So the innovative effects of public procurement, the way it's done today, is close to 0. And we need to change that. We need to see to that public procurement is used in a way that stimulates the development of new technologies, new solutions, enable people to take risk and develop the solutions that we so dearly need to solve the problems we are facing. So to summarize this and leave 2 minutes for questions, we are facing a transformation of a magnitude we haven't seen before. In this lies both risks, but also significant opportunities. We need to attack this not on a not based on feelings, but based on competences and a strategic understanding of risk-return relationships. We are trying to do that. And as Mark Twain says, the secret of getting ahead is getting started. From awareness to acceptance, and now it's time for action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we have a time for the questions if we have such in our room. Not? Yes, we have a question and the cookie goes. No, the microphone goes.
We're not so proud in Netherlands to having so many coal-fired stations. And once I suggested maybe we should introduce carbon dioxide tax. What is the status in Norway about carbon tax?
Yes, Norway is probably the country that has gone the furthest when it comes to introducing carbon tax. We have carbon tax on all important sectors, except, I guess, agriculture, which probably has around 0. But it's a stepwise carbon tax where you go from 0 up to around 2,000 kroner per ton, which hits the petroleum industry. And then we have also had a green tax commission that has looked into the carbon tax regime. And their advice is to neutralize this and find one level of carbon price that hits all sectors. And of course, their theoretical perspective is that that will reallocate resources in the most effective way. I think it's very, very hard to introduce one price for carbon across sectors in a Norwegian context, but we are moving in that direction. But the effect of carbon tax is very clearly visible in Norway, and it has driven innovation and it has driven investments.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? If not, then thank you very much, and in networking time.